Welcome to the Tim Booker channel, where wisdom is worth sharing. We wish you a pleasant listening experience. In this episode, we will be discussing Poor Economics. This book is authored by the 2019 Nobel Prize laureates in economics, Abhijit V. Banerjee from India, Esther Duflo from France, and Michael Kramer from the United States. They were awarded the Nobel Prize for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty, significantly enhancing our ability to combat worldwide poverty. In other words, these three scholars received the award for their contributions to global poverty alleviation. Now, let's delve into the book, Poor Economics, which was co-authored by the first two Nobel Prize winners mentioned. It's important to note that poverty alleviation is a global challenge. This book teaches us how to apply economic thinking and experimental methods to tackle this complex issue. Over the years, international organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank have invested substantial resources in poverty alleviation. Countless charitable organizations have also joined the effort. However, strangely, these large-scale poverty reduction efforts have often fallen short of their expected outcomes. According to the latest United Nations data in 2019, there were still a staggering 1.3 billion people living in poverty worldwide, with one-third of them being children under the age of 10. A World Bank expert wrote a book reflecting on poverty policies, titled The White Man's Burden, which highlighted the fact that over the past 50 years, Western aid to Africa has amounted to a staggering $23 trillion. But what were the results? In Africa, a simple 12-cent vaccine for every child could have reduced the number of deaths due to preventable diseases by half. Providing each mother with a $3 subsidy could have halved child mortality. Yet, even these seemingly straightforward goals were often not achieved. Some experts began to argue that poverty alleviation, as traditionally practiced, might be fundamentally flawed and counterproductive. For example, massive aid funds might contribute to increased corruption in local governments. The argument proposed by some was that the focus should shift towards helping these countries establish fundamental institutions like free markets, property rights, and the rule of law, and then let them develop on their own. According to this perspective, poverty alleviation without first addressing these fundamental institutions would be ineffective. The authors of Poor Economics disagreed with this viewpoint. They did not deny the importance of fundamental institutions, but they argued that waiting for these institutions to be perfected before starting poverty alleviation efforts would amount to shifting responsibility. In reality, the lack of effectiveness in poverty reduction efforts was not a result of poverty alleviation being inherently wrong but rather a consequence of flawed methods. So, where do the problems lie? Economics fundamentally examines choices and incentives. When viewed from this perspective, it becomes clear that existing poverty alleviation policies often either misunderstand the real needs of people or overlook the incentives that drive human behavior, resulting in less than optimal outcomes. To better understand the true needs and motivations of the poor, these two scholars established the Poverty Action Lab and conducted over 240 experimental projects in more than 40 countries worldwide. These experiments have revealed why poverty alleviation often fails and what effective approaches should look like. In the following discussion, we will analyze, from an economic perspective, how to address the challenge of poverty through three main aspects. 1. Understanding the real needs of the poor. 2. Motivating the poor to make the right choices. 3. Exploring whether the poor truly possess entrepreneurial spirit. Let's start with the first point, understanding the real needs of the poor. As the saying goes, people rely on reality as their field. To most people, the truly poor are those who can't afford to eat enough. In 2009, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization issued a statement that over 1 billion people globally were suffering from hunger. The logic here is that if the poor can't eat enough, they lack the strength to perform physical labor, which further exacerbates their poverty, creating a vicious cycle referred to as the poverty trap. According to this reasoning, the most urgent form of assistance for the poor should be food aid, especially staple foods. If they can eat their fill, the poor can increase their productivity, taking the first step toward escaping poverty, right? Therefore, governments in developing countries allocate significant funds to provide food subsidies to the poor, and international aid organizations also focus their poverty alleviation efforts on food assistance. However, what is the effectiveness of food aid? One of the most obvious problems is its inefficiency. In India, more than a third of the food aid goes missing during transportation, with most of it being destroyed by rats. However, the key issue is that it seems the poor do not benefit significantly from large-scale food aid. Food aid neither significantly improves their quality of life nor helps them escape the poverty trap. Why is this the case? Here lies a fundamental challenge with assistance and charitable work: a lack of feedback mechanisms. To illustrate this, Professor Su Xiaofeng provided an example in his economics class. If you run a noodle restaurant and sell beef noodles for $10 a bowl, and customers stop coming after trying it once, you would understand that the product is not satisfactory. You would then have a clear feedback mechanism to either improve the quality, reduce the price, or do both. Your improvements would be tested in the market. However, in the realm of charity, if you give away beef noodles for free, customers will keep coming for more, and you'll never know if they like the beef noodles or chicken soup noodles better. This is the challenge of charitable work: you have difficulty obtaining clear feedback from your customers, in this case, the poor. This is why charity work is often more challenging than business. However, this doesn't mean we should stop doing charity. It's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In fact, precisely because of the lack of clear feedback mechanisms, charity work requires careful examination of the real needs of the poor. Now, let's return to the issue of food aid. If the poor were genuinely starving, they would undoubtedly spend all their money on food. In other words, their Engel coefficients, the proportion of income spent on food, should be very high. However, the authors found through surveys of the living conditions of the poor in 18 countries that this is not the case. For example, in one Indian state in 1983, when most households had daily expenses of less than 99 cents per person, only 67% of their expenditures were on food. This percentage was not as high as one might expect. Poor people do not allocate all their money to buying food, and when their income increased in this state, they did not buy more staple food to increase their calorie intake. Instead, they chose to buy tastier, higher-priced foods. In another experiment, researchers randomly selected some impoverished families and sold staple foods to them at low prices. One would expect that with lower prices, these families would buy more staple foods. However, the opposite happened. Families that received food subsidies bought less staple food and more fish and meat. In other words, they upgraded their consumption. What do these examples tell us? They indicate that even very poor people in modern society can manage to eat enough. A lack of food is not their primary problem. According to calculations in the book, if people only purchase the cheapest foods, they can get 2,400 calories for just 21 cents, which is the daily energy requirement for an adult. Even the poorest people can afford this. However, this doesn't mean that poor people do not have nutritional issues. Their problem lies in the variety and micronutrient content of their diet. These problems cannot be resolved by traditional food aid, and even direct cash transfers may not address these issues. When poor people have more money, they often prioritize buying tastier food and non-essential items like cigarettes and alcohol over more nutritionally balanced and healthier foods. Here's an interesting statistic: over the past 25 years, as income levels for India's poor increased, their calorie intake decreased. This happened because as mechanization reduced the need for strenuous physical labor, people felt less hungry, so they stopped buying as much food. Instead, they used the money saved for other purposes, such as buying a TV or saving for their children's weddings. The authors found that in places where TV ownership was less common, people allocated a higher proportion of their budget to weddings and funerals. Why is this? TV and wedding/funeral expenses both represent entertainment needs for the poor, and they have a substitution effect on each other. This also suggests that the poor do not only have other needs after having enough to eat. In fact, the poor are willing to eat slightly worse food in order to save money for other needs. To conclude, more food aid does not increase the happiness or productivity of the poor. The entire approach to food aid is misguided. The correct approach should focus on delivering high-nutrient fortified foods to pregnant women and children, providing balanced and nutritious meals for school-age children, and implementing systematic deworming programs. Okay, that was the first key point I've shared with you. The difficulty in poverty alleviation stems from the lack of a clear feedback mechanism, which makes it all the more important to carefully examine the real needs of the poor. This is the first step. So, does understanding the real needs of the poor solve the poverty challenge? Of course, it's not that simple. Let's consider this example. Every year, around 1.5 million children die from diarrhea, primarily in South Asia and Africa, which are impoverished regions. Here, the need is very clear: to prevent and treat diarrhea. And the solution is simple: just add disinfectants to drinking water or provide oral rehydration solutions made from sugar and salt when children have diarrhea to prevent fatalities. Poverty relief organizations have long provided disinfectants and oral rehydration solutions at low cost or even for free. However, surveys show that only 10% of poor families use disinfectants, and only 1/3 of children with diarrhea consume oral rehydration solutions. Why is this the case? More importantly, this is not an isolated issue. There are many similarly low-cost, simple, and effective medical methods, such as using oral rehydration therapy for diarrhea prevention, and childhood vaccinations. The book refers to these methods as low-hanging fruit, but they are only low-hanging in appearance. In reality, it is extremely challenging to implement them in impoverished areas. Does this mean that the poor have lost hope and don't care about their health? In fact, the opposite is true. Surveys show that in many countries, the poor use most of their savings to seek medical treatment. If they fall seriously ill, they may sell their pots and pans or even borrow money at high interest rates for medical expenses. The issue here is that they spend money on expensive treatment rather than affordable prevention. What's more, their preferred choice for medical treatment is not the public rural health center but the local, barefoot doctor, followed by traditional healers like witch doctors. Why is this? Are the poor simply ignorant and beyond help? Upon closer analysis, you'll find a series of complex reasons behind this. For instance, the reason the poor don't seek treatment at health centers is because they are unreliable. In India, government regulations stipulate that public health centers should be open 6 days a week for 6 hours a day. However, these health centers are often mismanaged, with more than half of their working hours spent closed. Doctors and nurses have an average absenteeism rate of up to 40%, and even when they are present, their level of commitment to patient care is often lacking. As a result, the poor do not trust health centers. If a child has diarrhea, the health center typically prescribes oral rehydration therapy, which parents may view as inadequate, leading them to seek out a barefoot doctor for antibiotics, which can delay treatment. Why don't they add disinfectants to their drinking water? The reason is simple: it's too troublesome. Imagine being asked to add a disinfectant to your water every time you drink. Can you commit to that, especially when the benefits are in the distant future and the costs are immediate? This is similar to how it's challenging to maintain a daily exercise routine. So, what can be done? 2 solutions come to mind. First, minimize the inconvenience of implementation. For example, regarding adding disinfectants, researchers came up with a solution. They installed a disinfectant device next to the water well in each village. Every time someone fetched water, they simply had to turn a knob on this device to release chlorine, creating chlorinated water. This significantly increased the use of disinfectants. The second approach is to provide incentive mechanisms. Offer small rewards for people's actions. For example, getting children vaccinated is something most poor families understand is beneficial, and they're willing to bring their children for the first vaccine. However, they often indefinitely delay follow-up vaccinations due to various reasons, resulting in low completion rates. Researchers provided a reward of 2 pounds of dry beans to individuals every time they brought their children for vaccination. This had an immediate and significant impact, increasing the completion rate from 6% to 38%. Moreover, the reward of dry beans reduced the cost of each vaccination because medical personnel were more committed to their work. So, many medical aid efforts are ineffective because there's often a gap between knowing what's right and taking action. Effective medical aid doesn't just involve telling people what's right, it's more important to design incentive mechanisms that make it easier for people to take action. In helping the poor take the right actions, it's crucial to understand why some seemingly obvious solutions aren't adopted. Let's look at an example. In the Indian city of Kanpur, many poor people earn their living by selling vegetables and fruits. This is how the day goes for the street vendors. In the morning, they purchase goods from wholesalers for 1,000 rupees, then sell them with a 10% markup. After selling everything for the day, they make a profit of 100 rupees. However, it's essential to note that most vendors cannot produce the 1,000 rupees up front. It's essentially a loan from the wholesaler. So, out of the 100 rupees they earn, they have to set aside half, which is 50 rupees, to pay back the interest. You'll notice that this interest rate is astonishingly high, reaching a daily interest rate of 5%. To put this in perspective, if you borrow 5 rupees at this rate, you'd owe nearly 1 billion rupees after a year. Now, the question arises, why don't these vendors save up the 1,000 rupees to buy goods themselves? Doing this would eliminate the need to pay 50 rupees in daily interest, doubling their net income immediately. You might think that these vendors genuinely have no savings to put toward this, but researchers discovered this isn't the case. On average, these vendors spend 5 rupees daily on small luxuries like tea, snacks for their children, or little treats for themselves. If they were to save these 5 rupees each day for purchasing goods, meaning they'd borrow 5 rupees less from the wholesaler every day, they could become debt-free and double their income within just 50 days. You could argue that the life of these vendors is challenging, and buying a cup of tea or snacks for their children is the only solace they have. Asking them to refrain from tea for 50 days is a tough ask. The 1,000 rupees they need are equivalent to $20. So, couldn't charitable organizations provide them with this initial capital of $20 to permanently solve their problem? In fact, researchers did exactly that. They offered startup capital to some of these vendors and observed if this money could indeed permanently boost their income as anticipated. You may have guessed it already, it's not that simple. After 1 year, all the vendors who received assistance returned to their original state and had to borrow money daily, enduring the high 5% daily interest once again. So, what happened in between? The vendors didn't receive the money and become inactive or squander it. It's more about the numerous unexpected events that come up in their lives. When family members get sick, relatives get married, houses start leaking and need repairs, etc. Whenever such events occur, the vendors naturally think of using the operating capital to address these problems. In just a year, all those who received assistance were back at square one. The problem facing Indian vendors isn't an exception but rather a common dilemma for the poor: they can't save. When you don't have any extra money, you fall into the scarcity trap. Every day is spent dealing with various unforeseen issues, leaving no energy for long-term planning. Let me give you another example. In Kenya, only 25% of farmers use fertilizers each year. After accounting for the cost of buying fertilizer, farmers can increase their net income by 70%. So, why don't most farmers buy fertilizers? The answer is that by the time the planting season comes, most farmers have no money. Why don't farmers purchase fertilizers immediately after the last harvest season? The answer is that fertilizer shops usually don't restock at that time. So, farmers have to wait until the next planting season. But by then, the money has already been spent on various unexpected events, leaving no money to buy fertilizer. Upon learning of this situation, researchers initiated an assistance program called the Savings and Fertilizer Action. It involves offering fertilizers to farmers at a discount immediately after the harvest season and delivering the goods when the farmers need them. This program promptly increased the number of farmers using fertilizers by 50%. Alright, here's the second key point I've shared with you: awareness doesn't necessarily translate into action. Poverty alleviation doesn't only involve informing the poor about what's right but also necessitates designing incentive mechanisms to help them change their behavior patterns. In fact, many people believe that not only do the poor have the capacity to change their behavior, but they also possess significant entrepreneurial acumen. This belief is supported by data. Research data from 18 countries, including both urban and rural areas, show that roughly half of the urban poor have their small businesses, such as street vendors. Similarly, a considerable portion of the rural poor engage in small trading. Thus, it seems that the poor are natural entrepreneurs. This phenomenon led a professor from Harvard Business School to write a book called Billion Entrepreneurs, arguing that these poor entrepreneurs can change their destinies through their own efforts. However, there is an apparent paradox here. If the poor are indeed capable of doing business, why are they still so poor? What prevents them from expanding their businesses and prospering? The Indian street vendors example provides a clear answer: the cost of borrowing for the poor is exceptionally high. The economic rationale for such high interest rates is that lending to the poor carries substantial risks, hence the high interest rates. However, in the case of Indian street vendors, their actual default rates are quite low. Another study conducted in rural Pakistan showed that local moneylenders charged an average interest rate of 78% but faced a default rate of only 2%. From a bank's perspective, it appears to be a highly lucrative business. So, why didn't regular banks swoop in to take away the local moneylenders' business? Actually, many developing countries established specialized credit programs for the poor in the 1960s and 70s. For instance, the Indian government mandated that for every branch a bank opened in a city, they had to open 4 branches in rural areas. However, due to the surprisingly high default rates, these credit programs targeting the poor eventually failed. This illustrates that the job of a local moneylender isn't as easy as one might imagine. They need to monitor the borrowers continually, keep an eye on any significant events in their lives, offer advice for their businesses, and ensure they can access money immediately in emergencies. In essence, the management cost of overseeing every borrower adds up, creating high interest rates when applied to small loan amounts. It can be understood as the need for intensive monitoring of each borrower by local moneylenders that causes these exorbitant interest rates. Regular banks, due to the high cost of managing poor borrowers, eventually abandoned the market. It wasn't until the 1980s that someone came up with a solution for this issue. That person was Muhammad Yunus, the renowned Bangladeshi economist, who founded the Grameen Bank, a microfinance institution that lends money to the poor. This model spread across South Asia, with microfinance institutions charging an average annual interest rate of around 25%, much lower than the interest paid by street vendors. As a result, microfinance institutions raised high hopes, with many believing they could help 1 billion poor people become entrepreneurs and transform their destinies. Yunus's contribution to poverty alleviation earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. So, how did microfinance institutions solve the problem of high default rates among the poor? First, microfinance institutions primarily target female entrepreneurs. They believe women are better at managing finances and are more responsible. Second, they require a certain number of borrowers to form mutual support groups, making each member collectively responsible for the other's debts. The groups meet weekly to report on the progress of their businesses, and a staff member collects a portion of the repayments at these meetings. In essence, microfinance institutions have established a system that utilizes peer pressure and encourages social accountability to manage borrowers at a relatively low cost. This shows that microfinance institutions have quite rigorous management systems in place. Not just anyone can borrow money at any time. According to the author's research, only 1/4 of poor households turn to microfinance institutions for loans, while a whopping half still resort to local moneylenders to borrow at high interest rates. When delving deeper into it, one can conclude that microfinance institutions may not have had the transformative effect on the lives of most poor people, as they were promoted to have, aside from a few successful cases. This, however, isn't necessarily the fault of microfinance institutions. The more likely reason is that the assumption that poor people are natural entrepreneurs was flawed. Now, let's reconsider whether the poor truly have a desire to become entrepreneurs. The author found that no matter which country's poor population he asked, the majority hoped for a stable middle-class life with a secure income. They aspired for jobs like government officials, teachers, nurses, and other secure, well-paid positions, rather than taking risks by starting their own businesses. So, why do so many poor people engage in small businesses? The author suggests it's out of necessity. When they can't find good employment and lack specialized skills, running a small business is nearly their only choice. It must be acknowledged that possessing an entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial capabilities is rare, whether among the poor or the wealthy. For most poor people, the best way to lift them out of poverty isn't to lend them money to start businesses, but to provide them with stable, good jobs. What constitutes a stable, good job? For instance, the author observed that when there's a factory in a village that stably employs local labor, it transforms the entire village. For the villagers who become factory workers, it's not merely about gaining a stable income, it also offers them a sense of control over their futures, which drastically changes their attitudes toward life. Perhaps this is the right approach to poverty alleviation. So, that concludes the third key point: having an entrepreneurial spirit is a characteristic of the few. The best way to help the majority of the poor escape poverty isn't by lending them money to start businesses but by providing them with stable, good jobs. That's the essence of this book, and I've now covered all the critical points. Congratulations for completing another book. and thank you for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like and share this content with your family and friends. Knowledge is worth spreading, and together, we can create a brighter future. Thank you, and goodbye.